So our campaign is strategically curated to have what we call 6 key policy pillars. And in a way, I always say that it's my promise to Florida that within the first 4 years of my administration, we will either see progress within these areas or we'll see total reformation. And I'm very aware that for a Democratic governor stepping into that Republican legislature, things are going to be a challenge, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible. It's just simply going to be a challenge. And I'm up for the challenge and I'm up for that fight. So, the first thing that we want to do is make sure that we're establishing economic opportunity within our state, right? When we look at our small business owners across the entire state, they are the backbones of our economy, right? Florida is very tourism driven. And right now we have legislation in place that makes Florida, well, unwelcoming. And so, for example, referencing back to the LGBTQIA plus community, we have legislation in place where it has been deemed that Florida is unsafe for people of that community. So, of course, why would they come and visit Florida, right? They're not going to put their lives in jeopardy. There are also other things that are in place in terms of our legislation where morally and ethically people across the entire country have just put a red X over Florida and say, yeah, no, thank you, right? And that is affecting our budget. So, what we want to do is make sure on one side we are actually implementing the reformation and overturning some of these laws, which again will take time. But then, from an economic standpoint and through the budget, what we want to do is make sure that we're allocating funds for what we call micro grants. So instead of giving out loans, because it just seems like the government always wants us to be in some type of debt, and we're continuously going to be in this process of never ending paying for debt, right? We want to make sure that we are able to facilitate and give out micro grants to our small business owners. We also want to make sure that we are primarily investing within clean energy jobs, which kind of ties into our concern for the environment. So even though the environment isn't its own policy pillar, so to speak, within our campaign, a lot of what we want to implement are what we call legislation that is environmentally conscious. And so when we are investing within clean energy jobs, what we're doing is that we're preserving our future for the next generations to come, right? Because we have to make sure that we understand, and also Republicans too, climate change is real, right? And so we need to make sure that we are stimulating the economy, but also reinvesting within ourselves with these clean energy jobs so that we can ensure that we are protecting our water supply, our air quality, and also our land ultimately as well. Because when you think about it, right, we're human beings. We have to be able to breathe in oxygen. If we don't have at least any trees, well, how is that oxygen going to actually be created, right? And I'm no science teacher, but I do know that much, right? So, with economic opportunity, we also want to address the affordability crisis, which is a huge thing, right? It's plaguing everyone, and it really actually doesn't even matter if you're at the top of the food chain or if you're at the bottom. The affordability crisis is affecting everyone, right? So it just affects us in different ways. And I had a former volunteer on team who had said one time that we are all closer to becoming homeless than we are to becoming billionaires. For some of us, it might happen in 5 minutes. For others, it might happen in 5 years. But no one is guaranteed to be a billionaire at, the drop of a dime, so to speak. So when it comes to affordability, we wanted to take a lot of time to really make sure that it was ironclad. And so on one end, we want to address the affordability crisis primarily through housing. And so with housing, we want to make sure that we are addressing it through a renter standpoint and then home ownership as well. So as it relates to renters, what we want to do is make sure that we are primarily building mid-rises and high-rises in transit hub areas. Transit hub areas always usually have the zoning for affordable housing, so we're not stepping on the toes for environmental concerns. And then in addition, they are considered walkable neighborhoods. So if you are living in affordable housing, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that you do or you don't have access to a car. You can't make that assumption. But what we can do is make sure that you have the resources around you in your community so that you're not left vulnerable or in a disadvantaged state. Then we also want to make sure that for home ownership, we are utilizing public land. And there's this habit of Republicans that all of our public assets within our government are always handed over to the private sector. And I can't tell you why. Well, of course, we know why, right? has to do with something green. But nonetheless, these are our resources, right? Because our tax dollars go to this. Why would we just sell it off, right? And it kind of makes you even think back to when Rick Scott was governor and he privatized the Bright Line, and how the Bright Line is going out of business when before it used to be a public asset. So it's things like that. So we want to make sure that we're keeping our public land and utilizing it. And the way that we are able to provide relief to affordability is that if we partner with community land trusts, right, we're going to be able to build homes on public land. It makes the homes significantly cheaper, and it also gives homeowners an opportunity to save, right? And so as they're saving, what they're able to do is save to be able to purchase the home and the land elsewhere so that they're having total home ownership. And what we're doing is creating that bridge to what we call generational wealth. Because you have too many families where they either A, don't have a home and they're renting for the entire duration of raising their young family and their young kids, or B, which leads me to my next topic, is that property taxes are so expensive that they're not able to keep a family home within the family. So with the property tax issue, what I will say is this. I don't want to say that I don't have an answer for you all, but what I will say is that I am in, what do they call it? The lab cooking. So, and what I mean by that is we are researching and making sure that the proposal that we have is something that can tangibly be done. And so what I can tell you is this: we are looking at creating a progressive homeowners tax system. And what that means is that we would be taxing for property tax on the basis of the value of your home, but also keeping your income into consideration. It's very similar to the tax system that California has for income tax, but we're not doing income tax. We're trying to apply their system to property tax. So we have a little bit of forecasting that's going on, a little bit more research, but once it's fully ironed out, then that will be published on our website as well. So after I kind of looked at the economic issues and the affordability issues, and we also came up with some of these policy proposals, then we started looking into other areas as well. And so one thing that makes absolutely no sense is that, and I believe it was Bernie Sanders who said it, is our country is like one of the only countries that doesn't have a universal healthcare system. And it makes no sense that in 2026, healthcare for all is not something that has been established. Now, here in Florida, always say all the time that as governor, I intend on expanding Florida Medicaid. And so we're actually in our campaign getting ready to start to push out that advertising or that social media content to make sure that the ballot initiative that's being petitioned right now to hopefully get on our general ballots in November actually goes through for the expansion of Florida Medicaid. Because should Florida elect me to be its next governor, well, it kind of A, aligns with our policy, but also B, it makes my job just a little bit more easier to just have to sign an amendment into law instead of having to go back and forth with Republicans, which I'm not afraid to do, but you know, work smarter, not harder, right? So in addition to that, as it relates to our healthcare and making sure that we're establishing it as a right for all, we want to make sure that we're investing through the budget in resources like preventative care, making sure that we are bringing more competition in the state as it relates to insurance so that we're lowering down the premiums that are being paid, right? Also to tackling those prescription costs as well, and of course through the necessary state agencies, because as governor, I'm able to give the priorities for specific legislative sessions. Then also, one of our next pillars is gun reformation. And I believe that's probably more of a hot topic when you're here in North Florida and even Central Florida, a little bit in maybe Southwest Florida for sure. And I come from Broward County. I've heard someone from Broward County as well too is here as well. And one of the biggest tragedies that we have seen recently in the last several years is what took place at Marjory Stoneman Douglas, right? And those families will never be able to get their children back or their loved ones back. But even despite something like that happening on our home turf, Tallahassee still has not made the meaningful reformation as it relates to gun reform. And at Foster for Florida, we're not trying to take away anyone's Second Amendment rights. What we are trying to do is make sure that we are keeping our communities safe, that our kids are able to stay and lead long lives and be able to experience all the things that they should instead of it being terminated short and early. So one key piece of legislation that I will hopefully get passed through the legislature is what we call a safe storage law. And so a safe storage law requires for any gun owner that has minors in the home or individuals that have been deemed as red flags by the court system, that they have to make sure that they keep their firearm under lock and key in a safe. No exceptions, right? Because again, we have to practice precautionary measures of safety. Of course, we want to make sure that we're implementing universal background checks, that we're strengthening our red flag laws, right? And just ultimately changing that narrative for gun owners to know that, again, we are not coming for your rights. We are just trying to protect human lives. That is it. Our next pillar that we have is also related to immigration, right, and immigrants' rights. Oh, there's a spider. I was like talking and I was like, I hope I'm not like seeing things because it's been, a day. But no, I'm seeing correctly. It is.
I'll be the brave one.
Okay.
It's right here.
Right here.
You? Yeah. Where'd it go? Did I get it?
We'll let it live.
No.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, at least we know my eyesight's good. So, all right. So as it relates to immigration, I've seen that our social media really irritates Republicans when I say that no one is illegal on stolen land and that we need to make sure that we're treating one another with more of a higher regard as it relates to humanity, right? And when we look at what's happening, whether it's the ruling with TPS or what's even happening overseas in the middle as it relates to between Palestine and Israel, there's this lack of humanity, right? And we need to make sure that we are putting humanity on the highest of pedestals. And with that being said, what we want to ensure is that we're providing opportunities for our immigrants to create pathways for them to achieve citizenship, right? Now, we're not saying we're making immigrant citizens because legally we can't do that as a state, right? That is a federal responsibility. However, though, as a state, what we can do is help create those pathways, like I mentioned. So, for example, making sure that immigrants are able to get a Florida state issued ID, right? Because again, you want to make sure that you have those identification, and then you're able, for example, to put like a bill in your name, or maybe even get a library card, right? Making sure that our students have access to education, or our immigrants communities have access to healthcare. There's all these things that are starting to take place to X out our immigrant communities. And what doesn't make any sense to me is not to sound any type of way. Our immigrant population, they do the jobs that, well, the rest of us don't want to do. And they are giving back and aiding to our economy. So, as the young people would say, make it make sense, because it's really not making sense to me. So they always say on the Republican side of this dismantling of DEI. And what we have to understand is that our diversity is what makes us stronger. But in order to fully embrace our diversity, we have to have equitable and inclusive public policy. It's just as simple as that. And so, with that being said, as I get into our last pillar, which is education, which of course is very near and dear to me, being an educator. But like I mentioned before, Republicans, especially here in Florida, are coming for public education hard. And this upcoming school year, we are seeing the facilitation of Project 2025 in real time through what they call the FACT program. It's an opportunity to provide what they call factually accurate information to students and giving them an alternative to advanced placement courses. So for some reason, they have a FACT college algebra class. Couldn't tell you what you learn in algebra except for math and maybe a couple letters thrown in there for word problems. And I'm the math teacher, right? But then they have the fact US history class. And so this is to combat the equitable history, the inclusive history of what has transpired in this country, and not trying to, as my mother would say, put lipstick on a pig, right? What they're trying to do is change the narrative of the history of this country, and it is what it is, right? And in order for you to grow and move forward in anything in life, you have to acknowledge your past, you have to acknowledge your shortcomings, and then you grow from it. So what we want to do is make sure that through the Department of Education, and I've said this very openly, on day one of my top 3 priorities is to suspend and remove the board members of the DOE that voted to adopt the Phoenix Declaration, because that's how we're able to have the FACT program be implemented this upcoming school year. Then we also want to make sure that we are investing in public education, fully funding it. And I used to say fix it, but that was a poor choice of words. And so lately, if some people might have noticed that I don't say fix and fully fund, I say protect and fully fund public education, because that's where we are right now. And so through that, what we want to do is make sure that we're allocating the necessary funds to increase teacher pay. And so over the course of the 4 years, what we want to do is make sure that we are increasing teacher pay so that base pay for a teacher, 0 years experience with a bachelor's degree, they're making anywhere between $60,000 and $65,000 a year. And so it'll be tiered. It will be tiered so that veteran teachers that have the doctoral degree, that have the 20, 25 years of experience, are making the 6 figures that they deserve. Because we have veteran teachers where, not to sound any type of way, I make more than them. And that's not okay. So with that, we also want to make sure that we have universal school lunches. We also want to make sure that we establish an independent curriculum commission so that we can have an entity that can oversee the curriculum being taught in the state to make sure that we're not indoctrinating our students. Again, making sure that we're promoting that equity and that inclusion and promoting the diversity that has happened over the course of our history. Of course, removing these anonymous book bans, right, so that we can actually have books on the shelves for our kids to read, and just making sure that, again, we're protecting public education, because our public schools are resources for our communities, especially our rural communities as well. So a lot of times people always say, okay, well, Dayna, how are you going to fund all of this, right? And so what we want to do is look towards some of the areas within our policy pillars to see, okay, how can we close some of these loopholes? So first and foremost, as it relates to housing, for example, we want to close some of these loopholes as it relates to tax breaks for those that are wealthy. Also making sure that we're taxing the luxury non-resident properties, like so individuals that come and they have a residence and it's not their primary residence, right? We also want to make sure that we're increasing the corporate tax rate as well. Even if we increase it by 1 to 2 percentage points, that's an added $1 to $2 billion to our state budget. And so again, because I'm coming with this mathematical background, I have 2 degrees in finance, so I understand the state budget to the T. It's about making sure that we are being fiscally responsible. And so that's kind of maybe a Republican term, but nonetheless, we still have to be responsible with our budget, right? But we also have to make sure that we're increasing it some as well, because we do have one of the more smaller budgets out of all the states in the entire country. So with all that being said, right, my my proposal, my agenda, my vision, right, it's truly rooted in what we need as a people. And I always say that I'm the candidate that the people have built, because what I'm proposing, it's coming from the stories that I have heard and the research that I have done, and it's reflecting the voices of we the people. And right now we have a legislature in Tallahassee that is not passing legislation that matches our voices. And so, as Cameron mentioned, please make sure that you are registered to vote by July 20th. Please, if you are willing to, register as a Democrat so you can participate in our primary, and make sure that you are informing everyone that's around you, right? Because we all have our networks. And if we tell someone who tells someone who tells someone who tells someone, right, then we're able to, as we call, spread the blue flame. And I entered this race to ensure that we had an option other than what the establishment wanted us to vote for, that we had an option that is rooted in our values as a community and as a state. This is our home. This is our democracy. And so now it's time for us to take it back. Thank you.